Texas from the mid-20th century to the early 21st century, presidents and political changes. There are 4 key terms that you need to know for this section. A conservative is someone who holds on to traditional values and is cautious about change. Hijack, to seize a vehicle in transit and use for one's own purpose. Think of the planes from September 11th. They were hijacked by terrorists and flew into different locations. Deploy means to move troops into a position for military action, such as Iraq or Afghanistan. Domestic is dealing with home. In the government, it can mean within the borders of our country. So if the government is acting within its own borders, it's a domestic issue. If it's working outside, like in Paris or the Middle East, it's a foreign issue. We're going to talk about 3 presidents during this section. The first one is Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson became president after John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Before Johnson became president, he had spent time as a teacher in Texas. One of the programs he created was the Great Society program. President Johnson began a series of programs that were geared towards helping to reduce poverty and crime while abolishing inequality and improving the environment. We know these today as a welfare programs. Johnson started a war on poverty. Johnson's plan, War on Poverty, aimed at teaching skills to people so they can improve themselves and break the cycle of poverty in their families. Lyndon B. Johnson sponsored education reform. This program was meant to provide education, health care, equality to minorities and the poor. Some of his domestic policies on education probably came from the fact Johnson had once been a teacher himself. Civil Rights Act of 1964. President Johnson attempted to end the racial prejudice in the United States by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or natural origin. While Johnson was president, Texas citizens became more conservative. They did not care for the welfare programs or for other instances where federal government tried to exert more power over its citizens, and this led to more conservatism in Texas. Lyndon B. Johnson also had to deal with the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a civil war within the country of Vietnam. The U.S. supported Vietnam because they sought to have a democratic government rather than a communist one like North Vietnam. The U.S. wanted to prevent communism from spreading. There are 3 main events of the Vietnam War. The first is the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. The Northern Vietnamese attacked 2 U.S. ships in the North Vietnam Sea. Johnson called this an outrage and demanded action. Congress granted the president powers to use military force without declaring war on Vietnam. It was later discovered that the attacks in the North Vietnamese Sea may have been exaggerated. During the Vietnam War, Johnson's plans like the Great Society program were not able to continue due to funds being sent to the war instead. Tet Offensive. When North Vietnam began a series of attacks on the South called the Tet Offensive, the massive attacks were highlighted by news coverage and the true horrors of the war shown to the American people. And even though South Vietnam and the U.S. were able to hold back the advances, this event became a turning point in American support for the war. More and more Americans began to disagree with our country being involved, and this led to the eventual withdrawal of American forces from the area. American support of Vietnam. American citizens began protesting in the U.S. against our country being involved at all in Vietnam. These protests led to President Johnson not running for re-election. Citizens began to distrust the government, and people began demanding our troops come home. With public support shrinking in the U.S. for the war, troops were eventually pulled out of the area, proving that public opinion can have a positive or negative effect on the outcome. Next, we talk about George Bush. Now, this is the father. We're going to talk about two Bush presidencies. George Bush is the father. He is the 41st president. George W. is the son. George Bush, your 41st president, before becoming president, President Bush was a Navy pilot, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and some people must say the most prepared man to ever become president. In Bush's inaugural address, he said that the resources the country needed would have to be provided by the citizens. Important statement there. In Bush's inaugural address, he said that the resources of the country needed would have to be provided by the citizens. While President George Bush, remember this is the father, was able to work with Russia and its leader Mikhail Gorbachev and negotiate agreements that helped to reduce the risk of nuclear war. There are three main events in the George Bush presidency. The Persian Gulf War/Desert Storm. In August of 1990, the country of Iraq invaded their neighbor country of Kuwait. Iraq was after the oil industry that Kuwait had within its borders. And joined by many other nations, President Bush sent troops into the area to free the country of Kuwait. This operation was called Desert Storm. Desert Storm lasted for 2 months, but not removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq would impact events when Bush's son, George W. Bush, that's the son, was in office in 2003. Policies during Bush's presidency. Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 was created to prevent discrimination against people with disabilities. Bush continued the war on drugs and signed laws and policies to crack down on illegal drug use and distribution. In 1992, there was a presidential election. There were three main candidates: George Bush, the Republican candidate and the sitting president, George Clinton, the Democratic candidate, and Ross Perot, an independent. Ross Perot was a conservative. Like Bush, he opposed NAFTA, which handles trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. With both Bush and Perot running with conservative values, Americans split the votes between the two candidates. This was the main reason why Bill Clinton won the election. This election proved that third-party candidates like Perot can influence the outcome of elections. Now this is George W. Bush, the son. George W. Bush, the son. 43rd president. George W. Bush, son of George Bush, served 2 terms as president in 2000 and 2008. We have 3 main events from his presidency. The 9/11 attacks. September 11th, 2001, a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda orchestrated an attack on the United States. They hijacked several planes while in transit to use them as weapons. 2 planes were flown into the World Trade Center buildings in New York City. 1 plane crashed into the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C. 1 plane was retaken by passengers and crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Al-Qaeda claimed they attacked the U.S. because of their support of Israel and their involvement in the Persian Gulf War during President Bush's presidency. The effects of September 11th. The 9/11 attacks had a major impact on the lives of Americans and how our government prepares for and tries to prevent future terrorist attacks. One of the major effects citizens encounter is the increased security at airports, large arenas, and venues and government buildings. Our Constitution states that it's the government's job to protect the country and its citizens. In the Constitution it states, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and provide for the common defense." It's that provide for the common defense is the portion of our Constitution that the government used to protect the country and its citizens. Provide for common defense. The main people affected by September 11th were the civilians aboard the hijacked planes, the workers in the World Trade Center buildings and the Pentagon, the firefighters and police officers who worked to save people following the attacks, and the people of New York and Washington, D.C. Policies and action created by the government. President George Bush, the son, created agencies and added measures to the United States to help prevent such attacks from happening again. Bush created agencies and added measures to the United States to help prevent such attacks from happening again. The Department of Homeland Security was created to prepare for and defend the country in emergencies and terrorist events. The U.S. Patriot Act was passed, which armed law enforcement with new tools to detect and prevent terrorism. Some lawmakers and citizens question whether these policies overstep the bounds of the Constitution. Airlines. The Transportation Security Agency, TSA, was created after the attacks. One of their main roles was to enforce security measures and examine passengers and luggage to ensure no one and nothing dangerous is allowed on any plane. Due to the fears over safety of airline travelers immediately following 9/11 attacks, the airline industry lost billions of dollars. Following the War on Terror. Following the 9/11 attacks, President Bush began what was called the War on Terror. The ultimate goal was to end terrorism around the globe. The United States invaded the country of Iraq in 2003. George Bush's reasons were the Iraqi people were oppressed by their government and ruler Saddam Hussein. Bush wanted to give the people freedom as well as democracy. And Iraq was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, and Iraq was considered a threat to the world. The War on Terror is still an ongoing war for America and many of its allies. That was Texas from the mid-20th century and early 21st century, Presidents and Political Change. Good luck and thank you.